Hi everyone, welcome to the Enthusiastic Buddhist. In today's episode, I want to look at a very important teaching in Buddhism, which is the teaching of no self or selflessness. This teaching is known as Anatta in Pali or Anatman in Sanskrit. As you might recall, in the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha taught that suffering or dukkha exists in our lives, and that the Buddha's teachings are simply a pathway to enlightenment so we can end our suffering altogether. Well, to become enlightened, what it really means is to wake up to the true reality of things so that we can see who we really are at the deepest of levels. That is what enlightenment is all about. And it's at that moment when we have the realization of selflessness that all our suffering falls away. But because we're not yet enlightened, our current understanding of the world and who we are doesn't actually match the reality. So because of this confusion, this is why we suffer. As I mentioned in my video on the nature of the mind and the 5 defilements, there are certain defilements that our mind can be under the influence of at any one time. These being the defilements of anger, craving, jealousy, pride, and ignorance. And of these defilements, the most subtle and actually the most harmful is the defilement of ignorance, because this allows all the other defilements to arise. Now, none of us like to be called ignorant or stupid, but what the Buddha is really saying is that we're ignorant about who we really are, and we're incorrectly identifying with a self, which actually cannot be found if we really chose to investigate. You see, right now we all have this feeling that there is somebody here who is watching this video, and we have this very strong sense of who we are. We really identify with our personality and our likes and our dislikes. For instance, our sense of identity might be made up of the ideas that I am Bob, who is a firefighter, who is married, likes pizza, and enjoys playing golf with friends on Sundays, or something like that. So we have this very firm concept of who we are in our minds, and we strongly identify with it to the point that it influences all our life choices, like what style of dress we should wear, what kind of car we should drive, etc., etc. Now you might ask, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with being an individual and feeling a strong sense of who we are? Well, there's nothing wrong with having an inner confidence about who we are, but the Buddha pointed out that unless we're enlightened, then we're just identifying with the wrong version of ourselves, and we're creating so much unnecessary suffering because of our wrong identification. You see, some of the downfalls of having a firm belief in self is that by default, we then create all the separation between ourselves and others. So we create all this duality in the world. And from this very strong notion of me and I, we form all our attachments. So we have my house, my car, my job, my family, my land. And from this springs all our fears, our desires, our hopes, and our aversions. And the Buddha said, so long as we hold this belief that there is someone here who is experiencing all our pleasures and pain, we will continue to grasp at pleasure and do everything to avoid pain. And as our mind moves incessantly between these states of craving and aversion, we'll constantly be agitated, and our minds won't ever reach a state of peace and lasting happiness, which is what we're all looking for. So the Buddha was a very good questioner, and he wanted us to examine why we hold so strongly to this fixed idea of an independent, permanently and inherently existing self that is here experiencing this world. Where do we derive this notion of self from? He said, where is this I? Point to it for me. Well, he didn't actually say those words exactly, but he wanted us to investigate. I mean, one of the first things we can look at is, are we our names, for instance? We certainly can get very attached to our names as being part of our identity. I mean, when we're in a group and we learn that someone else shares the same name or a similar name to us, there's sometimes a small part of us that says, hey, but that's my name. I want to be the only David in this group. It's almost like we feel our identity might have been compromised by the existence of another person with the same name as us. Or we take it to the extreme, and even if we're born with a name that we don't like or one we're constantly ridiculed about, we still don't want to change it because it makes up part of who we think we are. Or we might even name our sons or our grandsons so-and-so junior because we want to live on in others through our name. So we have to admit, most of us think we are our names. But if we look at it closely, are we really our names? I mean, my name has changed several times in my life. I have my maiden name, my married name, the name I had when I was ordained as a nun. So which name is really me? Then if we're not our names, the next thing we identify very strongly with is our bodies. But where in this body does this I exist? Our bodies are constantly in a process of transformation. Old cells die and are replaced by new ones, and even the bones are replaced. And surely our body when we're 80 is not the same body we had as a newborn. So how can the body constitute a permanent self? And what if someone was to cut off our arm? You know, as the limb starts to rot and decompose, I'm pretty sure you won't have any problem dissociating from it. You know, that's not my arm, I don't need that anymore. So how much of our body do we need to cut away before we lose our identification with it? Basically, when we investigate, we'll see that we derive the sense of self due to a rapid interplay of many physical and mental processes. The Buddha explained that we all have 5 aggregates or groups or bundles of things that work together which form the sense of self. In Pali, the aggregates are known as khandhas, while in Sanskrit they're called skandhas. And the first aggregate that the Buddha taught about is the aggregate of form or matter. Now, I hope you can stay with me as I try to walk through these teachings on the 5 aggregates, because for me, this teaching was one of the most mind-blowing of all the Buddha's teachings. And I would think, oh, if I could only have been taught something like this in my psychology degree. Anyway, now the aggregate of form or matter, this includes the 4 great elements of earth, water, fire and air, and all the forms, internal and external, that are derived from these 4 elements. So this includes all the components of our physical body, such as our skin, our organs, our bones, hair, blood, etc. But in particular, the Buddha specifically wanted to draw our attention to the 6 sense organs and their corresponding objects. So we all know we have 5 sense organs. These are the sense organs of the eyes, ears, nose, tongue and body. And when they're working properly, they can detect the 5 sense objects of visible form, sound, odour, taste and tangible things. So the eye can detect visible forms and the ear can detect sounds and so on. Well, the Buddha also included among these organs a 6th sense organ, that of the mind. This is a faculty that can detect mind objects such as thoughts, ideas and conceptions. However, even though it's grouped within the aggregate of form, it's said to be part of consciousness as opposed to something physical and tangible. The next aggregate of the 5 aggregates is the aggregate of feeling. However, in order to make these aggregates easier to understand, I want to talk about the aggregate of consciousness first. Now, there is a different consciousness that can arise depending on which sense organ and sense object come together. So if the eye sense organ meets with a visible object, then eye consciousness arises. So in the same way, you can have ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and intellect consciousness. So the coming together of the sense organ and sense object allows the corresponding consciousness to arise, and it is this arising of the consciousness which actually links the sense organs and sense objects and allows us to become aware of the presence of that sense object. So unless our eye consciousness arises, the eye won't be aware of the visible object. It simply wouldn't detect it. But once the eye consciousness arises, it forms an interaction between the sense organ and the sense object, and this allows us to become aware of the presence of that object. So it is this interaction between these three, the sense organ, the sense object, and the sense consciousness, which is called contact. And I want to re-emphasize here that we're simply becoming aware of the object's presence. We haven't actually recognized it or labeled it yet. That's where the other aggregates come into play. So once we have contact, this allows for the three other aggregates to arise. These aggregates are the aggregate of feeling, the aggregate of perception, and the aggregate of mental formations, which is sometimes also known as simply the aggregate of fabrications. Now, the aggregate of feeling refers to feelings that arise from eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, and intellect contact. And there are three different kinds of feelings we might experience. These are pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, or neutral feelings, which are neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So it's from the contact of the sense organs, their sense objects, and the sense consciousness that these feelings can arise, and these sensations can be either ones we enjoy, dislike, or don't feel strongly about either way. Then there is the aggregate of perception, which is what actually identifies what has been noted by the relevant consciousness. And this allows us to recognize it, label it, and categorize it. So this aggregate basically allows us to start making sense of the world, because up until this point, the aggregates could only perceive things but not give it any meaning. So an example of this aggregate working is that if you're drinking a cup of tea, for instance, through the contact of your tongue, the taste of the tea, and the tongue consciousness, you can perceive the tea's flavour, because your tongue consciousness allows us to become aware of it. And for the aggregate of feeling, in this example, the sensation might be quite pleasant because it's warm and it's a flavour you enjoy. Then it's your aggregate of perception that actually recognises the liquid as tea because it fits into your mental category of what the properties of tea should be like. So, for instance, it's a liquid, you don't have to chew it, and it has some flavour instead of just tasting like water. So for this aggregate of perception, we're now able to identify the stimuli around us. And also, just for the sake of completeness, I'll quickly mention that within the aggregate of perception, there are 6 modes of perception we can have. These are the perceptions of form, the perception of sound, of smell, taste, tactile sensations, and the perception of ideas. Now, the last aggregate I want to talk about is the 4th aggregate, which is the aggregate of mental formations or fabrications. In this aggregate, we have all the different ways we can react to a sense object and our feelings and perceptions of it. So, as the name suggests, this aggregate is interested in the ways we can initially react on a mental level before we follow through with some behaviour of our body, our speech, or our mind. So for instance, if someone accidentally bumped into us, once our aggregate of perception has perceived that a person has bumped into us, we might react by developing anger towards them. Then we might decide to aggressively push them back, abuse them with our speech, or continue to think negative thoughts about them. But if we respond initially with a mental attitude of forgiveness, we might then give them a friendly smile, say no worries, and have pleasant thoughts of friendliness. So this aggregate is interested in all the wholesome and unwholesome intentions or impulses that arise in relation to what we see, hear, smell, taste, feel, and think. And these intentions are what arise before we continue to act out with our body, speech, and mind. In Buddhism, we refer to these intentions as volitional actions. And when we're talking about volitions, we're really talking about karma and the karmic seeds that we're planting. So these volitions have the power of bringing us happiness or suffering. They may be meritorious and ripen into pleasure, demeritorious, which ripen into pain, or imperturbable, which are related to the jhanas or deep meditative states. But perhaps one of the most important aspects about this aggregate is that this is where all our habits of mind are created. This is where we develop all our ideas, our opinions, our prejudices about things and people, as well as all our compulsions. So this aggregate really determines whether we develop positive qualities of the mind or not. This is where we can shape our mental habits and the person we want to become. And there are approximately 51 different types of mental formations belonging to this aggregate. So I'll put a link on my website for you to view the whole list for those who are interested. So what do these teachings on the 5 aggregates tell us? Well, one of the great things about this teaching of the 5 aggregates is that it shows us that our reactions to people or situations in life aren't immediate and automatic. There is a process involved. We're not at the mercy of our feelings or thoughts, and we actually have a choice in how we respond to everything. And this is a very liberating concept because it means if we can develop enough mindfulness to recognize our impulses or intentions as they arise, we can then learn to replace them with more wholesome ones, and we can decide whether we actually act out on them or not. We can decide whether we verbally abuse someone who's insulted us, or whether we practice patience in a challenging situation. Basically, we can decide what karma we create and whether we move towards enlightenment or not. So mindfulness is the quality that initially allows us to depersonalize the aggregate, so we won't see the thought as being my thought, which I need to hold and cherish, but we can simply see a thought as a thought, a mere phenomenon which we can choose to entertain or not. And when we work from this perspective, that our thoughts are nothing more than an entity that arises and passes away, it brings a lot of lightness to our thoughts. We won't allow ourselves to get so caught up in them anymore or get stuck on certain thoughts. Instead, we'll be able to become dispassionate and objective observers, and we'll be able to remain calm and peaceful while thoughts arise, whether they're wholesome or unwholesome ones. And this will also help us to develop greater compassion because as our wisdom increases, we'll start to see how others are ensnared by their thoughts, which are all derived from their belief in a permanent and inherently existing self. So getting back to what the teachings of the 5 aggregates means to this concept of selflessness or no self, well, the Buddha explained that these 5 aggregates are the basic elements of a person, and they're in a state of continual change. For instance, an unpleasant feeling passes away to give rise to a pleasant feeling. One moment of consciousness is replaced by a different consciousness based on a different sense organ. And of these aggregates, none of them can stand alone and be said to possess a separate identity or constitute a permanent self, because they are in a state of constant change. I mean, every moment the senses come into contact with a sense object, these 4 processes of consciousness, feeling, perception and mental formation occur with lightning speed. And because it happens so fast and we don't see it occurring, it gives us the appearance of continuity and that we're an unchanging entity. So it's just because of the combination of these aggregates working together in this physio-psychological machine that we get the idea of of permanency and a permanent I, and we conveniently label it a self. An analogy that's often used in the teachings is the example of a chariot. As you know, a chariot is something that's made up of various different parts. It has the wheels, the carriage, the axle, and all the things that join it together. So the chariot actually doesn't have any inherent existence in itself. There's no real chariot there. It's just an assemblage of parts, which we conveniently call a chariot for the sake of easier understanding, instead of saying, that thing that rolls along the ground and is joined by such and such part. So in essence, we are like a chariot. We are composed of the 5 aggregates, which are a combination of physical and mental phenomena that are constantly in a state of change. And because of the apparent continuity, we designate ourselves as a being or self. But this doesn't actually reflect our reality at an absolute level. And the Buddha pointed out that as long as we continue to hold this belief in a self, we will continue to grasp at these aggregates as being ours, and we won't be able to identify with anything else, so our identity will be restricted. The Buddha said, "It's just as when a dog is tied by a leash to a post or stake. If it walks right around that post or stake. If it stands right next to that post or stake. If it sits right next to that post or stake. If it lies down right next to that post or stake." In the same way, an uninstructed, run-of-the-mill person regards form as, "This is mine, this is myself, this is what I am." He regards feeling, perception, fabrications, consciousness as, "This is mine, this is myself, this is what I am." If he walks right around these 5 clinging aggregates. If he stands right next to these 5 clinging aggregates. If he sits right next to these 5 clinging aggregates. If he lies down right next to these 5 clinging aggregates. It is just as when, there being dye, lac, yellow orpiment, indigo or crimson, a dyer or painter would paint the picture of a woman or a man, complete in all its parts, on a well-polished panel or wall, or on a piece of cloth. In the same way, an uninstructed run-of-the-mill person, when creating, creates nothing but form, feeling, perception, fabrications, consciousness. Now what do you think, monks? Is form constant or inconstant? Inconstant, Lord. And is that which is inconstant easeful or stressful? Stressful, Lord. And is it fitting to regard what is inconstant, stressful, subject to change, as this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? No, Lord. Is feeling constant or inconstant? Inconstant, Lord. Is perception constant or inconstant? Inconstant, Lord. Are fabrications constant or inconstant? Inconstant, Lord. What do you think, monks? Is consciousness constant or inconstant? Inconstant, Lord. And is that which is inconstant easeful or stressful? Stressful, Lord. And is it fitting to regard what is inconstant, stressful, subject to change, as this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? No, Lord. Thus, monks, any form whatsoever that is past, future or present, internal or external, blatant or subtle, common or sublime, far or near, every form is to be seen as it actually is, with right discernment as, this is not mine, this is not myself, this is not what I am. Seeing thus, the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones grows disenchanted with form, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with perception, disenchanted with fabrications, disenchanted with consciousness. Disenchanted, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, he is fully released. With full release, there is the knowledge, fully released. He discerns that birth is ended, the holy life fulfilled, the task done. There is nothing further for this world. So the Buddha was saying that once we realize we are not our thoughts, we are not our feelings, we are not our perceptions, then we won't continue to cling to them and will finally be liberated from our self-limiting views. And I say liberated because it's all our self-grasping that creates all our suffering. It's all our clinging to concepts like, they did this to me, I want it my way, they forgot my birthday. All these conceptions and the mental stories we build on them only bring us a lot of suffering. At the moment, we live with our minds being in such a state of tension. Our minds are like closed fists, just grasping and clinging to the solid identity of self. But what happens when we let go of that grasping? All the stress and the tension and anxiety disappears, and all our clinging to our stories and all our comparisons with others just falls away. Instead, it becomes possible to live in the world with greater lightness of being and ease. And it's from that space of peace and tranquility that all our best decisions can be made. Now, just because we wake up from this illusion of self doesn't mean that we suddenly disappear. We don't disappear into some black hole and just cease to exist. I mean, when the Buddha became enlightened, he didn't just vanish into thin air. He still had his body, his speech, and his mind. He just didn't identify with his aggregates as possessing some permanent entity. When speaking to a monk named Bahuna, the Buddha explained, "Freed, dissociated, and released from 10 things, Bahuna, the Tathagata dwells in unrestricted awareness." Which 10? Freed, dissociated, and released from form, the Tathagata dwells with unrestricted awareness. Freed, dissociated, and released from feeling, from perception, from fabrications, from consciousness, from birth, from aging, from death, from suffering and stress. Freed, dissociated, and released from defilement, the Tathagata dwells with unrestricted awareness. Just as a red, blue, or white lotus born in the water and growing in the water rises up above the water and stands with no water adhering to it, in the same way the Tathagata, freed, dissociated, and released from these 10 things, dwells with unrestricted awareness. So once we are freed from the constraints of identifying with the 5 aggregates, the Buddha perceived that there is still an unrestricted awareness that remains. There is some kind of consciousness or cognition that is experienced but doesn't have the aggregates as its support. The Buddha said, "Consciousness without feature, without end, luminous all around, does not partake of the solidity of earth, the liquidity of water, the radiance of fire, the windiness of wind, the divinity of devas, and so on through a list of the various levels of godhood to the awness of the awe, i.e. the 6 sense spheres." So this consciousness that is without feature, without end, and luminous all around doesn't relate to any of the 6 sense organs and continues to be experienced when these 6 senses stop functioning. However, even this unrestricted awareness is not something we can pin down at any one moment and say, "That's me, that's my permanent self." No, that's me, that's my permanent self. Because it's constantly in a state of change. So that's all from me for this video. This video is really to introduce you to the concept of anatta and selflessness, and to explain how these 5 aggregates of form, feelings, perceptions, etc. are what we are wrongly identifying with as being who we are. And when we do have the realization of selflessness, there is this tremendous freedom that comes with it, because we're no longer confined to our limited views of who we are, and nor are we grasping at anything as being an extension of ourselves. So we can let go of our need to cling to our possessions or even people in our lives. In fact, we'll appreciate everything more and in a much more freeing way, and we can really learn to love others unconditionally. Now in my next video, which is really part 2 of this explanation of no self, I want to explain in more detail about this unrestricted awareness or continuum of consciousness, so you can better understand how one moment of consciousness carries over to the next. And I'd like to share some more sutras on what the Buddha said about no self and the freedom that comes from having this realization. So thanks everyone for watching. Please like and share this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel for more videos and check out my website enthusiasticbuddhist.com for more on Buddhism and meditation. So take care everyone, have a great week, and I hope to see you in the next video.